Okay, so we were in the middle of reviewing chapters 1 through 4 from Michael Schwalbe's The Sociologically Examined Life. And fundamental aspect of sociological analysis is seeing connections between different institutions, seeing connections between our individual identity and behaviors and the larger social context. And so having a sociological perspective often involves making that connection between the micro and macro, as well as looking at how all these different social institutions such as housing, education, mass incarceration, health are all connected to one another. So the whole idea is that the individual cannot exist without society, and society in turn is shaped by individuals. So if we are taking a larger view of things, it means analyzing how our individual decisions are then shaped by being socialized in a particular context, right? And the example Schwalbe provides to us is often connecting the different roles we occupy, right? And Schwalbe is making the assertion that you can't really keep these different roles and contexts that we occupy as watertight from one another. Inevitably, there's spillover that's going to happen from one sphere to the other. So the example we left off talking about was about how often folks who study gender transformation or transformation in gender roles and equality will find something that they have termed as the stalled revolution, right? That we see a lot of change when it comes to women entering the labor force, entering areas which had previously been male dominated, but we've seen a stalled revolution when it comes to gender division of labor at home. And sometimes folks defend this using tropes such as, well, I was never raised to do these things, or it's just good to maintain the balance, etc. But the argument that Schwalbe is making is that if you expect things to be pretty traditional at home, inevitably the spillover of those expectations is also going to happen at work. And indeed, this is backed up by data where we find that women are often concentrated in human resources. Within the corporate world, human resources is one of the least paid parts of the corporate world. The moment you see feminization happening of a particular occupation, it goes down in the status hierarchy. Within the corporate world, again, women are expected to mentor without any extra compensation because they're just seen as caring, right? They're seen as folks who might not make very good managers, and there are lots of double standards about that. So when I say double standards, I mean the same kind of behavioral traits that are seen as really assertive and good leadership in men is often seen as being belligerent and hard to work with in women, right? So that's what I mean by double standards. We'll revisit these ideas when we look at gender, right? So Schwalbe is saying that you can't treat these things in isolation. They have to be seen in connection. This is where he's asking us to also read indexes, right? So the fact that we're seeing inner city conditions, right? Whether it's roads with potholes in them, or neighborhoods that seem unsafe, how do we then interpret that? So when we say reading indexes, a particular phenomenon such as unpaved roads becomes an index to something else that's happening in that context, right? There's a tendency, Schwalbe says, to look at inner city conditions or unpaved roads and blame that particular community, right? So if there's high poverty, high crime, high unemployment in predominantly communities of color, there's a tendency to blame those communities as lazy, as folks who don't deserve handouts, etc. And so our job as sociologists is to analyze where did all of that come from, right? And part of that is that structural analysis. Part of that is looking at policies, right, that led to those conditions. And what was the logic behind those policies? Who had the power to make those policies throughout our history, right? Why were those policies designed, right? So asking those kinds of questions and then thinking about how what we do in our housing policy is then going to be connected with the quality of schools and other services in that community, is going to be connected with the capacity to build wealth for certain communities versus others, right? Schwalbe also chooses the controversial example of name changing, right, where women take on the last names of their spouses. And he's pointing out that when we think of historical traditions such as those, it may be true that when women change their names today, they're not necessarily thinking that they are becoming property of their husbands, but that's how the particular tradition originated, right? And so it's really important to look at the roots of certain traditions and then kind of decide what was the purpose of this and whether it's still playing a role in maintaining inequality, maintaining the status quo. And you can do a quick check by saying how many men take on the last names of their wives. Very few. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. Nowadays folks are hyphenating and maybe both partners take on the hyphen. It's more common in same-sex marriages. But it's still very unusual for men to take on their spouse's last name. And then you have to ask the question why, right? If indeed it's no big deal, then why is it so lopsided, right? And so Schwalbe is saying that we need to look at these little things, right? Because those little things, many of those little things together create a culture. So when you're doing an analysis of culture, you have to look at the cumulative effect, right? Not necessarily a simple causal effect, like simply taking on someone's last name is not necessarily going to make you subservient, but it's the larger culture. It's the accumulation of all these little things and traditions and practices and language, right? The fact that we continue to say chairman or mankind or you guys, right, becomes part of sort of normalizing the world from this male heterosexual perspective, right? And so even though you may say watching violent movies or playing violent video games is not necessarily going to make someone go and rape another person, again, we are looking at the cumulative effect of all these things together that create a rape culture that we will definitely analyze under our gender and sexuality segment. So one of the last ideas I want us to think about with these first 4 chapters from Schwalbe is this notion of deviance. And when we say something's deviant, it's the opposite of normal, right? So when someone's or something is not normal, we think of it as deviant. And it's very much connected to this idea that Schwalbe is presenting, is that all of our reality is socially constructed, right? And therefore, norms alone are not sufficient. So there are some norms, some rules of interaction that we've created together, right? These norms can be casual rules of interactions, what in sociology we call folkways. They can also be mores or more serious norms, such as most cultures presently have a taboo against incest. So these are these norms, formal, informal rules that we follow in society. But when you do an analysis of deviance, you see that norms alone are not sufficient. It's a matter of who has the ability to impose your ideas as normal. And that's where power comes in, right? Because as sociologists, we are asserting that it's not within our scope to determine something as inherently wrong. But powerful groups in our society determine what is considered deviant, right, versus normal, right? So in our class, especially when we cover the chapters on power, we will look at this idea of hegemony. And hegemony largely is this idea of ideological control, where we use beliefs, norms, values shaped by the ruling class to justify status quo as natural and normal, making these power dynamics and structures invisible, right? Because when you normalize something, you don't even question it. And so I have these images here to help us question what we deeply believe as normal versus deviant. And when I present these images in class, where you see this kid who looks passed out on the right, surrounded by beer bottles, his friends probably thought this was amusing. And often we too in the classroom may smirk at this and be like, oh, that's nuts. But we also normalize this as a rite of passage, as someone who's perhaps freshman in college and has been binge drinking. In fact, that's the short class there, which says alcohol, the key to surviving college. So we have a tendency to normalize this kind of behavior, which is actually very dangerous. There are young folks who die from hazing rituals in fraternities and so on. The young woman on the left would be seen as highly deviant because she seems to be drinking while pregnant. But what surprises folks often is that there are many different cultures who have different rules about this. It's not uncommon for women in France who might be pregnant to have a glass of red wine. Their doctor might say, you know, it's better than you being stressed out. In the US, this is taboo. Like, there could be wait staff at the restaurant who will take the glass away from you if you are visibly pregnant. And so, very different criteria in different cultures. And of course, that doesn't mean we're condoning yet. Of course, we know fetal alcohol syndrome is a very serious thing. So it's always better not to take a chance. But the argument I'm making is that the biggest risks to pregnancy are still pollution, malnutrition, and you don't see us outraged about that. There are many women who are forced to live and work in very dangerous conditions in our society with just a notice that tells them, hey, it's hazardous to live here or work here. And we don't get outraged about that as a society. So it's really important to think about these things as we think of social problems, deviance, and so on.